Now, if we wanted our website to not just detect button presses, but also to detect keyboard key presses to activate the relevant drum. Say if I press the W key, then it should activate this drum, and if I press J, then it should activate the snare. Then how exactly do we do that? Now, instead of adding an event listener to listen for clicks, we can listen to a key press event instead. So we would write something like add event listener key press, and notice that the weird thing about events is that they're named all in lowercase. And it's a good idea to take a look at the docs whenever you're trying to type them, because it's pretty counterintuitive. So we're going to try and target this key press event. And if there was a key press, then we'll simply call an anonymous function which sends an alert that says key was pressed. But the problem is, what exactly do we add this event listener to, right? Because previously, we added our event listener to all of the buttons so that when the buttons get pressed, then the event listener gets triggered. But in this case, we're kind of waiting for the keyboard keys. So how do we add an event listener to the keyboard? Well, you don't have to. You can add an event listener to the entire document so that the entire web page starts listening for keyboard strokes. So now let's hit save and let's refresh our page. And if I tap on any of the keys on my keyboard, then I get the alert that says key was pressed. Now the next problem is, how do we figure out which key was pressed exactly? Now remember how we said that when we add an event listener to an element, then once the event happens, the element will trigger the function that's in the second parameter. So in this case, when a key press is detected, it will trigger the function that tells the browser to show an alert. Now, when that function gets triggered, there's also the option to pass in a parameter. And we can call that parameter event or E, but essentially what it allows us to do is it lets us tap into the event that triggered the event listener. So instead of showing an alert, let's console log this event and see what we get back. So now if we refresh our page and we press any key, then you can see that what's logged in here are the keyboard events that triggered the event listener. So if you expand this, you can see that it actually gives you a whole bunch of information, including the key that was pressed to trigger the event, other things such as the key code, the character code, and a whole bunch of other things. So you can see that whenever I press any key on the keyboard, this event tells me which key was pressed. And that's kind of what we need in order to get our drum kit going, right? And if you look in the docs for the key press events, then you can see that they have a whole bunch of properties that we saw in the Chrome developer tools. And you can read about what each of them do by taking a look at the MDN docs. Now, the key that we're most interested in is this one called key. And this is the key value represented by the event. So which key on the keyboard got tapped, essentially. And this is what we need in order to figure out which sound to play. So notice how we already have this switch statement, which checks to see which key was passed in and responds by playing the relevant sound. Now the problem is that this is all inside the event listener for our button clicks. So as a challenge, I want you to create a function that takes a character and checks it against the switch statement in order to play the correct sound. And then we're going to call it inside the event listener for the key press, as well as the event listener for our drum buttons. So pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create this brand new function. And I'm simply going to call it make sound. And it's going to take a single parameter, which is going to be the key. Now inside this function, I'm going to relocate our switch statement. So I'm just going to cut it, and then I'm going to paste it inside my function, make sound. Instead of switching on the button inner HTML, I'm going to switch on this key. And I'm going to pass in that key by calling make sound, passing in the button inner HTML, which is essentially the inner HTML of the button that got pressed. But I'm also going to do the same thing down here. So I'm going to get rid of the console log, and instead we're going to call make sound, and I'm going to use the event dot key. So now I have one section of my code, which is all about detecting button press. And then I have another part of my code, which is all about detecting keyboard press. And if a button was pressed, and then I check the inner HTML of the button that got pressed and send that to make sound in order to play the relevant sound. And if a key press was detected instead, then I send the event.key, so the key property of the event. So say if I press on the W button, then it's make sound W. And if I press on the W key on the keyboard, it's also make sound W. And they end up in here where we switch based on that key parameter. And then we play the relevant sound depending on which key was passed in. So let's save this and see if it works. So first I'm going to check by clicking on my buttons. Seems to work. And now I'm going to try and type in the characters. Awesome, right? So in this lesson, we learned about how you can add event listeners to detect keyboard strokes. And we used the same method, add event listener, but we added it to the entire document instead of a specific button or a specific element. And once that was detected, then this function gets called, passing in the event that triggered the key press. And that event contains a property called key, which tells us which keyboard key was pressed. And then we send that over to our function make sound in order to make the sound that we want for that key. Now, in order to fully understand this part of the code, we have to understand how in JavaScript we can pass functions as parameters. And we can also have functions as callbacks, which include things that we get back after the event has happened. So in the next lesson, we're going to explore some of those concepts in more detail so that we can really get to grips with what exactly it is that we're writing here. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.